But we are going to move on to focus a little bit more on the topic of expenses, because that is, I guess, a really tangible area that might be hit by the current financial crisis. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who has been doing a little bit of research on this. I will leave Sarah, if you're okay, to introduce yourself fully, and then I will get your slides lined up. So thanks ever so much, Sarah, for feeding in.
Thank you, Rihanna. So yes, I'm Sarah. I'm the volunteer coordinator at Harewood House. Unlike Rob, this is the first time I've been presenting to HVG, so please bear with me. If you haven't heard of Harewood, we're based in Yorkshire. We are a historic house. We're also an educational charity, and we're very fortunate to have around 200 volunteers. So if I can just wind back a bit and explain a bit of the context about why this research has happened, why we undertook it. We conduct an annual satisfaction survey amongst our volunteers, and this spring, what one or two were saying to us, that they felt post-COVID that the asks of our volunteers was increasing. We were demanding more from them, but at the same time they could see that some of their tangible benefits were being eroded. And so I didn't really know how to answer that, because I didn't know what any other historic house or similar organisations and museums, what their policies were. I just had no idea. So I couldn't look them in the face and give them the answer that they wanted. So I started off thinking, who could I contact regionally within Yorkshire? And I came up with a very simple survey. And actually it took off, and a really big thanks to everybody who contributed to the survey. And in the end, we received responses from 31 organisations, and it was a really good cross section. We had local authority run museums, we had historic privately owned houses, we had nationally funded museums, so rural locations or city based. So we had a really good cross section to get a feel of the benefits that volunteers were receiving. So hopefully, can you see the slide? Can you all see the slide? So what were the headlines? What was coming out of this? Yeah, there we go. So that shows some of the what I've talked about, the context, and then the research. It was taken in the spring of 2022 this year. So the headlines, actually 81% of the 31 actually do pay travel expenses. And I had a little look at the 6 that didn't, and I couldn't find any commonality. They weren't all local authority run museums, they weren't all city-based museums, they just were all very different. So I couldn't get any correlation there. Then I had a look at the amount per mile paid, and this ranged from 25p to 47p, but the majority, almost 2/3, do pay the 45p, which is in line with the HMRC guidance. But I don't think that guidance, I don't think that's changed since about 2010, 2011. So it's a very long time since that's been updated. Quite a few, well, the majority have a cap on the amount of expenses they pay per day. But here there wasn't an overall consensus. Some capped it at just £5, whereas at the top end, there were some were capping at £18. So, and at the time in the spring, this was really before the cost of living crisis was really taking off. Fuel prices were starting to go up, but at this point, over half were considering reviewing the policies. So I think it'd be interesting to know whether this year, in the last 6 months, anybody has made any changes. We've looked then at other benefits, tangible benefits that the volunteers receive here at Harewood, and we're looking about being allowed to bring in visitors with them. So again, we found a significant amount of museums, organisations allow their volunteers to visit on days when they're not volunteering and bring in with them guests. And again, it was either 1 guest, 3 guests, or unlimited. There were some that were really quite generous policies in this area. And the third area we looked at were the discounts offered in shops and cafes. And again, nearly 3/4 offer a discount in the shops, we found, and 53%, just half, in the cafes. So I never thought I'd be able to say this, Rihanna, but next slide, please. So we, later on in the summer, we did a supplementary survey, and this was about subsistence. We didn't cover that area in the first survey. Slightly less number of respondents, 16 this time, and we found that a much smaller number actually pay a subsistence allowance. So only 4 of the 16 respondents, and again, 3 of them were under £6 and 1 was unlimited. So I have found this information really quite useful, because it has given me the opportunity to benchmark our policies against other organisations, to find out where we were in line and where we were an outlier. And this has given me some hard evidence, because I know how challenging the next year's budget rounds are going to be, but this has provided hard evidence that where we are less generous and we are an outlier. So we presented this paper to senior management, which will then hopefully go as part of the next budget cycle, and we hopefully will see some improvement in the areas where we were less generous. And obviously we'll be reporting this back at our next all volunteer meeting. It's quite interesting to be able to look at the data in the round, because it could be that an organisation doesn't pay expenses but has a really generous policy in terms of allowing the volunteers to come and visit and bring the guests. And in the current climate, it's maybe worth posing what is most important to them. Is it the fact that we can provide a space that they can come for free and with the friends and enjoy? Is that important to them, where they've got to go? If they wanted to go out for a day somewhere else, there'll be a cost involved. But if they can come to our organisations and enjoy a day with their friend, do they value that? Is that more important than having their costs, their travel costs reimbursed, or a subsistence allowance? And I think you do need, as an organisation, to look at all the benefits. We've focused very much on tangible benefits. I think there is as well, there are other things that we provide for our volunteers, of which helps with their mental and health and well-being, again, which also fits into this bigger picture. I think that's all I want to say at the moment, before we perhaps go back into breakout groups again. Is that right, Rihanna?
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think that gives us a really interesting picture of the sector and kind of what is the current practice. We're not going to go out into breakout rooms anymore, but we would love to hear any kind of initial thoughts that people have on that research, and any reflections that they might have. And I think the question for me is, what is missing potentially from that research? Would it be useful to conduct something like this again in the current climate? So yeah, I think any general thoughts would be really useful to hear. So if you could raise your hand, either using the raise hand function or literally raising your hand, that would be fab, and we can see what thoughts there might be from the room. Annette, it'd be great to hear from you.
That research was really interesting, and it's given me some things to think about and to talk to my colleagues about. But what I was wondering about, another question could be asked, is what combination of benefits you offer? Because so we have a range of benefits we offer volunteers. So you might have more of one thing but less of another. So in our organisation, we give 50% off in our cafe, and we give a discount on cinema, and then we give 30% off in our shop, and then we give parking expenses, but we don't offer travel and we don't offer subsistence. So that's a question that was interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I guess the context of each organisation is going to have a slightly different variety of benefits. Do you have any sense, Annette, of kind of which of those goes down best with your team? Anything that they would like to see instead?
They really like having the cafe discount because it's quite a generous one. It's a very noticeable benefit. I think they would like to be able to bring guests for free to exhibitions, which we don't do. They can come to the exhibition for free, but their guests can't. So that's one I would, and also free cinema tickets, I think would be another nice one to give.
Brilliant, yeah. Thank you. And any thoughts, Rob, on what you've just heard?
No, I think all of those things are absolutely fine, and I think it's absolutely right that we should be looking at what other benefits, what do the volunteers want, what works for them. The only caution I would put around it is that that's conversation with your existing volunteers. What about people who aren't existing volunteers who you want to bring in? So particularly if you're looking to diversify your volunteer base in any way or reach out to new audiences, are those the kinds of things that they're going to be looking for? Or are they going to be looking for something that's a bit more tangible, like reimbursement of parking or mileage or something like that? And if they are, great, but how open are the rest of the organisation to them making those kinds of things available? It's that classic thing, isn't it? Most of us are volunteer managers. Most of us are working in roles where we can see what needs to happen, but we've got to convince somebody else to make that change. And it's quite easy for a finance team to kind of go, oh, well, it's all right for, a couple of free tickets to events or a 15% discount on a cup of coffee in the shop versus actually hard tangible cash that needs to be made available. So I just think about what's needed for that kind of broader audience that you might want to engage. But all sensible suggestions people are making, yeah.
Lovely. And from my perspective, I guess I'm from the old guard of volunteer managers. When I was starting out in this area, people were very cautious about this variety of benefits, I think, thinking of them as in-kind payments and how, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know, Rob, whether you've got any thoughts on that, because obviously some of those ideas are really creative, but they make my old bones a little nervous, I guess.
Yeah, and if I was a lawyer here, which I'm not, I'd be telling you, oh, don't offer things of material benefit, don't offer things that may be counted as, in legal terms, what's called consideration, because it'll mean you've got a contract of employment with your volunteers and then you're really up the creek without a paddle. But I think, we've got to be realistic and look at, most charity shop networks, the volunteers get either first pick of the donations or a bit of money off. National Trust have offered free membership to volunteers in return for a certain amount of time for years. There's loads of organisations that do these things. You need to be mindful that if you have a really serious breakdown in relationship with a volunteer, to the extent that they want to take you to an employment tribunal to prove that they're an employee and therefore entitled to a whole bunch of rights, these things can come back to bite you in the butt as a consequence. The simple solution to that is don't discriminate against people because they're volunteers. And as Matt's just said in the chat and others have said, is put the risk in perspective. It's risk management, not risk avoidance. So treat volunteers properly, practice good volunteer management across the organisation, and the risk that something will go wrong is far, far lower. The only practical thing to be aware of, and it was interesting with the research that Sarah was talking about, where I think you mentioned, Sarah, a 47p mileage rate, is you're quite right, that 45p rate's been in place for years and years and years. But HMRC are really clear that if you ever reimburse people above that minimum, that can incur a tax liability on those individuals. That's not an organisational tax liability, that's an individual. So that's just, don't pay flat rate expenses for food and travel. Use the actual rates that are provided, but don't go above those rates and you're far less likely to have problems.
Thank you for that, Rob. I think that's a real kind of tonic for me to be more creative than perhaps I've been in the past. So thank you. We are rapidly running towards the end of the session, but I want to ask the top voted question to Rob. So you're going to have to give a succinct answer here, Rob, because time is short.
Right, that's a challenge.
Yep, absolutely. I'd like to challenge you at the end of a session. So if organisations are thinking of promoting themselves as warm hubs, how are they supporting staff so they feel confident welcoming volunteers in potentially desperate situations?
That is a really great question. The quick answer is I don't know, because I've only heard anecdotally that organisations are thinking about it, not that they're doing it. But I think it's a really important point. It's a bit like doing criminal record checks. Lots of us do criminal record checks, but how many of us have been trained in helping people deal with emotionally unburdening themselves about convictions from years ago? Most of us probably haven't and have probably never encountered it. So I think if you are going to look at doing that as an organisation, then you do need to make sure that the staff are properly trained and, really importantly, properly supported in doing that as well.
Lovely, thank you, Rob. Very succinct. Tamsin, did you want to come in with some last comments on that question? I know you've written some great comments in the chat.
I just think it is a really important area. I think there are resources available that you could look at. You know, if you Google trauma-informed practice, emotionally laden work, I think what's really clear is that you have a direct and open conversation about what happens if. So it's almost scenario planning so that your volunteers, as a minimum, feel comfortable knowing what to do if they're presented with a particular situation, and that they will be safe and they will be supported and backed up. Other organisation I would just highlight is Cruise. So Cruise has a huge range of information around bereavement, and essentially everything we're going through here is about loss. It's about loss of identity, loss of future, and that's the palpable emotion people are going to be feeling.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tamsin. Wow. Well, I think we could keep talking about this topic for the next 6 months of coffee afternoons. So we will, as a committee, have to think about how we do kind of pick up this conversation and continue to talk about it. But I'm afraid I am going to have to draw the session to a close there, as we are 1 minute over 4 o'clock.